Welcome. In this video, we'll be taking a look at how to factor completely. So this video is actually putting all of the ideas that we talked about so far together. So if you haven't watched any of the videos on factoring, make sure you go back and watch each of those videos before you attempt the problems in this video. So what we're supposed to do is factor this expression. And so before we do anything, before we use any of our techniques like factor by grouping or key number, the first thing I want to look for is, can I factor out a GCF other than 1 from all of the terms? So looking at all the terms, I definitely see that we could factor a 2 out of all of them. And I also see that we could factor a y to the third out of all of them. So my first move is actually to factor 2y to the third out of that entire expression, out of each term in that expression. So if I factor 2y to the third from the first term, I'll be left with 4y to the second. And if I factor 2y to the third out of the second term, I'll be left with minus 19y. And if I factor 2y to the third out of the third term, I'll be left with negative 5. Okay, now this single term out in front, I'm done with that. There's really nothing more that I can do in terms of factoring because I'm really only interested in factoring expressions with more than one term. So I'm really done with this guy in front. But notice how it did make what's left over a little bit more manageable. The numbers are a little smaller. And notice that there are 3 terms there. So that means I'm going to use the key number method on what's left. So that means that this 2y to the third is just going to sort of like hang out, and I'm actually just going to kind of work and just ignore it. And so when I'm using the key number method, again, I'm multiplying the 2 outside guys together. So 4 times negative 5 is negative 20. And the middle guy is negative 19. So I have to think of 2 numbers that multiply together to be negative 20. At the same time, those numbers have to add together to be negative 19. And so I think in this case, negative 20 and 1 is going to be my winner. So now, again, that 2y to the third is just going to hang out. And what I've just figured out is how to break up this middle term. So I'm going to use my key numbers. So I'm going to break that into negative 20y plus 1y minus 5. And then I've got 4y squared. And then I still have this 2y to the third, of course, just following along. And now looking at the inside part, remember I don't care about the 2y to the third, so I'm just looking at the inside part. And I just want to factor each group on the inside. So looking at the first group, well, I can definitely factor a 4y out of each of those terms. So when I factor 4y out of the first term, there's a y left over. When I factor out a 4y from the second term, I have a minus 5 left over. From the second group, 1y and minus 5, the one thing I can really factor out there is a 1. That's their greatest common factor. So when I factor a 1 out of the first term, I'm left with y. When I factor a 1 out of the second term, I'm left with minus 5. And then I've got parentheses around the whole thing because of this 2y to the third. So the final step then is the 2y to the third stays on the outside, and then on the inside, I've got y minus 5, that's the group they have in common, that leads us off, times the leftovers, which is 4y plus 1. And now, let's look at a way I can simplify this. Well, this says I'm taking 2y to the third times this whole expression, but since these two guys are being multiplied already, I don't need this outer set of parentheses anymore. So a simpler way to write this would be 2y to the third times the factor y minus 5 times the factor 4y plus 1. And that's my final answer. So the first step whenever you're factoring is to look for a GCF of all of your terms. If you see one that's larger than 1, then the first step is to factor that guy out of each term. So I want you to try number 3, pause the video, and then restart it after you've given it a try. Okay, so for number 3, again, the first step is to factor the GCF out. So what I see there is we could factor a 2y to the 5th out of that whole group. If we do that, we'll be left with 16y squared plus 24y plus 5. And now since there's 3 terms on the inside, we're going to use the key number method on those. Remember, we're done with this 2y to the 5th, so it's just going to follow along. On the inside, we've got 16y squared plus 24y plus 5, so we're going to use the key number method. If I multiply my two outside guys, that gives me 80. If I drag down the middle coefficient, that's 24. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply together to be 80, and at the same time add together to be 24. So I think the winning combination here is going to be 20 and 4. And now that tells me basically how to break up the middle term. So instead of having 24y, I'm going to have 20y plus 4y. And now if I group the first two guys together and the last two guys together, the first group I could factor out a 4y, it looks like. So we're going to factor a 4y out of the first group, which leaves me with 4y plus 5. The second group, I can only factor a 1 out, which leaves me with 4y plus 5 on the inside, and then parentheses around the whole thing because we have this 2y to the 5th. So my final answer, if I look at the inside, I've got the 4y plus 5 group in common. So I've got 4y plus 5 times the leftovers, which is 4y plus 1. And then, of course, this 2y to the 5th, which is just riding along. So that also has to be included in my final answer.